So I want to talk to you this morning. I want to talk to you this morning about the Mission 3.0. It's a language that we have begun to describe and or use to describe what's been going on in church missions, and take you back to the early days in which I was working with a local church here in town, Church of the Resurrection, and we knew that there were there was this need to do the missions that we were doing in a different sort of a way, and in the same way that we intuitively feel it in this room, and we're wrestling with what that might look like, and we didn't have words for it, and we were reading the books, and we were trying to get our heads around it, and then trying to figure out how we would encompass this in a church that was already doing a lot of wonderful things, both locally and around the world. And little by little, the language began to form in our minds, and we would go back and forth over certain things, and at times we would get frustrated with the relief and betterment things that were going, and we, out of frustration, would call the positive volunteer experience benevolent narcissism, and all of these things that we needed to say in a sense to kind of deal with the pressure of what was going on in all of this space. And little by little over that time, as we continued to kind of press into this, a way of thinking about what it is that the church is involved in right now began to unfold. And it dawned on us in the process, and you're going to hear from Jonathan Bell in a minute, who was the missions director at Church of the Resurrection at that time, that there's a couple of different ways that we could position this whole conversation. And one could be in this either-or mindset in which development is good and relief and betterment are bad. But that's not quite what we were looking at. That's not quite the way that we want to say it. It's not that relief and betterment are bad and that development is good, and so we need to get rid of all those other things because, well, that's not even scriptural. So we began to wrestle with that, and we eventually kind of came to this idea that probably the best way to talk about this is in the same way that we talk about computer upgrades or program upgrades. Is that you have Windows 1.0, you have Windows 2.0, 3.0, 4.0, all that. And that it's not that 1.0 was bad or 2.0 was bad. It was that as time goes on and you begin to understand things a little differently, you upgrade. You have to do something. And what we were sensing was that missions needed this upgrade, if you will. And so how could we couch this language in such a way that said, okay, relief and betterment are important and they're good, but we may need to wrestle with those things in a different way, and we need to add something to what the church is doing. What if we called this whole thing Missions 3.0? And Jonathan's going to unpack this a little bit more in a minute, but the idea of 1.0 was how we raise money. 2.0 was how we get people into the game. And we were doing those things. Churches are doing those things in a wonderful way. But what if the thing that's missing are the structures and strategies that could get us to sustainability? What if we called that Missions 3.0? So we began to work through some stuff. And an interesting thing happened to us in which some things really kind of fell into place. We got invited to do a short little presentation up at Willow Creek Community Church. You know that little church up in Chicago? So there was a group of large church mission pastors that get together and they talk about some of the things that they're wrestling with as large church mission pastors. And we got invited to kind of speak to that group about how churches might begin to focus more on sustainability. And as a part of that, I had been doing some conversation with the Global Impact Investment Network out of the Rockefeller Foundation in New York City. And what they were doing at the time was they were developing the language, the lexicon, the taxonomy, if you will, to use to be able to begin measuring the impact of impact investing around the world. And so my conversation with them was, is the church at the table? And is anybody from the church kind of working with you guys to just participate in this process of creating a language? So what they were doing, to kind of oversimplify it, was if you're going to measure the impact of impact investing in sub-Saharan Africa, then you have to begin to have this list of terminology that you're willing to use. So I can't call it livestock and you call it cows, because then how do we really accumulate the data that we need to? So they were working through this taxonomy, if you want. And I just thought it would be a great thing if we could just be at the table. And what they said was, no, nobody from the church is at the table. And I asked them, well, would you be willing to, would it be okay if somebody from the church was? They said, sure. So we Skyped them in to talk to this large church network of mission pastors to talk a little bit about the Global Impact Investment Network and what it would be and da-da-da-da-da. And what I thought in my mind was that, boy, if we had them Skyped into this thing, that this group of large church mission pastors would get all excited and we'd be talking about how we might be able to sit at the table and just be with the Rockefeller Foundations, just get into that world a little bit. And what ended up happening in that meeting was the whole conversation just seemed to go right past this group of mission pastors. And it was kind of nice, but not necessary. And I remember us going back into our room. Jonathan and I were there together, and after that, there was this little disconnect and saying, gosh, I'm not sure I understand why. I mean, these are some really sharp people and some incredible churches, but for some reason, the opportunity to be at the table in this conversation seems to be passing them by. What's going on here? And so that night, and as we were sitting in our room just really hammering it out, some things dawned on us. And what we began to realize is that in the world of church missions, there are these 4 domains. There are these 4 areas that are always working, and to this point, are working primarily competitively with each other. And I just want to share them with you real quick and go through them. That in the world of missions, as I began to look at what I had dealt with in church missions most of my life, I began to realize that some of the people, when you bring into the conversation of church missions, what they're looking at is the individual. So it depends on who you're talking with about church missions. But when I mention church missions to a missions pastor, one of the first things they think about are the people in their church. It's about the individuals in their church because they've been hired to provide positive volunteer experiences for individuals as part of their spiritual formation. And I don't disagree with that. That part of our spiritual formation is that we understand that God has given us certain things in our life that he means for us to use those things for the sake and the good of other people. But when we look at missions, the whole thing through the lens of the individual within our church, then we tend to try to put things together in such a way that it will meet the needs of volunteers, usually from the abundance side of things. And we end up getting, when that becomes the primary focus of our church missions, we end up getting the kinds of things that When Helping Hurts and Toxic Charity talks about. But nonetheless, some people in the church are looking at missions through the lens of the volunteers within their congregation. But then I realized there were also those who look at church missions primarily through the church lens of mobilization. So when a senior pastor, for example, stands in front of a church, they're not into the weeds about what it takes to do whatever it takes. But that pastor is tending to look at things in terms of his or her responsibility to mobilize resources and deploy them. And so what a pastor oftentimes needs are short little 30-second videos about individuals doing wonderful volunteer work at home and abroad, and it's all positive because he or she has 2 or 3 minutes to really cast vision for people to give, I'm oversimplifying, people to give their time, talent, and treasure to be doing these good things around the world. And so as a church, you tend to look at missions through mobilization and deployment. I'm always looking at missions about how do I get more people involved? How do I mobilize them? And so if you think about it for a second, if you try to put up in front of your people this vision of sustainability that takes 20 years and processes infrastructure and research and development, how do you put that on a video on a Sunday morning service to get people all excited and say, oh man, I want to be a part of that mission program? And so it tends to be that when we're trying to mobilize resources, again, we tend to go towards the relief and betterment kinds of things because it's easier to picture. But again, I want to say there are people in the church whose responsibility it is to mobilize and deploy resources. They look at missions through the lenses of deployment and mobilization. There are some who look at missions through the lens of the individual that they're trying to disciple. And then there are some people in the church, I think, as you start to work a little bit more and you realize that we've got to be dealing with indigenous people. I mean, we can't just be bringing all of this stuff to people and doing it to them or for them. And so we begin to then wrestle with the whole idea of the partnership. Because I can't just send my people over there and do stuff to them. How do we begin to mobilize people, and what do we do, and then how do we begin to execute? And so the partnership is about how those with resources partner with those who are under-resourced to end up doing something for the constituency. And so if you're in that role, and oftentimes that's a mission pastor who has been in this space a little bit longer and realizes that, yeah, I've got to work with my folks on a positive volunteer experience, but I've also got to develop the partnership. And you're looking at it through the lens of the partner who's saying to you, guess what? Your volunteers that are showing up here are overhead. They're more work than they're worth. Now, they'll never say that. Usually they won't say that out loud, but if you get deep enough into the partnership, they'll start to say, you have no idea how you're wearing me out. Because I've got to create these easy on-ramps. And so the person who's responsible for the partnership starts to look at missions through the complexity of what it means to partner together. And then if you go right into the community, at the community level, if people are looking at missions through that level, they're looking at it in terms of transformation. You go to the people actually in the community, the people that you're actually trying to serve, guess what? They don't care if you provide a positive volunteer experience for rich folks from the West. Do you really think they're going, ooh, my, I can't wait till those folks come here because I'm going to give them a positive volunteer experience with those poor folks in the third world. And I'm being facetious here because I want us to kind of jolt out of this for a second and realize that there are 4 distinct groups that are looking at missions through 4 distinct lenses anytime we talk about missions. And we realized that as we were talking with these mission pastors up there, that part of what's happened is that there is this paralysis. Because the more you live in this space, the more you become aware of these 4 different streams that are existing in this space, and they're struggling with what it means. And so what we tend to do is we tend to pick 1 or 2 of those, and we focus on those. And oftentimes, from churches with resources, it's easier to focus on the top 2 because we can control that. We can control the whole idea of how we put people through spiritual formation, and we can control the positive volunteer experience, primarily in mobilizing resources. And so we get this disconnect. And what began to dawn on us was that we just need to call it out. We just need to say, look, all 4 of those lenses are present in any church. And we're no longer at a place where we can prioritize one over the other. We have to live in tension with all 4 of those things. And what the church, I believe, is being called to do right now is how do we integrate all 4? How do we look at all? Because it is important for us to focus on the individuals within our churches and the way in which volunteering and those kinds of things is part of their spiritual formation. We do need to mobilize more resources within our church for the things that can help. And we do need to develop partnerships. And ultimately, it needs to get to the community level where it's providing long-term sustainable transformation. But just realizing that those 4 domains existed gave us the opportunity to begin to talk to people from each of those areas and begin to say, what would it look like for us to start talking about how we work together? Because guess what? There will always be all 4 of those domains working at the same time. So that was one of the first things that really helped us to get our head around what we were doing and what we are doing with Missions 3.0 right now. Part of it is how we help integrate those 4 things so that they work together within a church, within a ministry, so that it ends up creating the opportunity for sustainable kinds of things. But then the second thing began to happen to us, and that was, why do we even want to utilize the church in this whole process? Why? Look, why don't we just kind of close up shop, so to speak, when it comes to the missional stuff? Why don't we just preach the gospel about the sweet by and by, and why don't we just let secular philanthropy and that group take care of these more intractable problems right there? And, I've wrestled with this in a lot of different ways, and I do believe the church is the hope of the world, but I don't believe that we're the hope of the world de facto. I believe that if we will be the hope of the world to the extent that we step up to the challenge that it will take to reconfigure ourselves. And that God will do that with ready and available people, but we will have to step into that. So that began me thinking a little bit to move out of the theological realm for a second and begin to ask the questions in a very pragmatic way. What's the value proposition? Why could the church be a part of this? What does the church bring to the table beyond the fact that we have scriptures that tell us that God loves the church and those kinds of things? Is there any practical things? And so I began to reformulate this in a value proposition because I was asked to do a little presentation at the Kauffman Foundation and then was asked to come back at another time and do it with in front of the FDIC about a year ago. So I said, what if I could present this in a value proposition that's more pragmatic? What does the church bring to the table that no other organization? And I would suggest to you, and this is how I started out my talk at the Kauffman Foundation. I said, if I were an atheist, which I'm not, I would still want to work with the church. And here's why. And by that time, I had everybody leaning in because they knew good and well that the stuff that we were doing was with the faith-based community, in particular the church. And I said, here's why. If I were an atheist, I'd still want to work with the church. Because first of all, the church is the greatest mobilizer of philanthropic dollars in the whole wide world. There is no other organization that raises and gives away more money than the church, Big C church. Put it all together, there's nobody that even comes close. So the church is already mobilizing financial resources into this space. But the second reason I'd want to work with the church, and by the way, everybody in the crowd is shaking their head, yeah, that's right. There's a lot of money that comes from the church. So the second reason I would do it is because the church is the greatest mobilizers of volunteers in the world. And we've got data that will prove it, but there's no organization that mobilizes more volunteers than the church anywhere in the world. And we're not going to be able to tackle some of these problems without volunteer help. And then I asked the crowd, mostly business people, are you going to be willing to give your time in these spaces? You know, they're not. No, we need volunteers. So the church is the greatest mobilizer of volunteers in this space. And the third reason that I'd want to work with the church is that the church is the first in and the longest to stay in the most difficult situations throughout history. The church has proven that it will go in the most difficult situations and it will stay longer than anybody else because it's built into our DNA. It's built into the stories. Every Sunday we have pastors that stand up and preach sermons on the Good Samaritan. Inasmuch as you've done it to the least of these, you've done it to me. I mean, our whole story is about that and the incarnation of Christ and the incarnation of his people with hurting people. And so it's in our DNA to go into difficult places and to stay for a long time. That's the kind of people you'd want to work with, isn't it? And then the fourth reason is because we've got the greatest delivery system in the whole wide world. There's a church on every corner in virtually every country around the world. And so here's the proposition, folks, which I said to them and I would say to us. Nobody has done better at relief and betterment around the world throughout history than the church. For all of those reasons, because we raise money, because we put people into action, and because we have this incredible delivery system. We're the first in and longest to stay. But the world has gotten to the point where it's no longer just enough to do relief and betterment. We've got to do sustainable kinds of development. And here's my thought. If the church could do development as well as it's done relief and betterment, wouldn't you want to work with the church? And in both of those presentations, which were primarily to secular audiences, everybody shook their head. There isn't this thing in which we don't want the church involved in these things. I'm not experiencing it, not in my city, not in the places that I'm going. I'm hearing people say, if you can get the church to do development the way they've done relief and betterment, you're darn right we'd work with you. We'd work with you in our school systems. We'd work with you in our city governments. We'd work with you throughout all of the entities that make up our communities and that sort of thing. And so that's been the thrust by which we have kind of moved forward with this Mission 3.0 for churches and believing that the church could be a part of that kind of work that brings about sustainable development, that we could learn to do that the way that we've done relief and betterment.